I want you to imagine for just a moment that you are standing on the pavement outside a really large, older house.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and you are watching this truly violent storm roll in. I mean, the wind is howling, the rain is just lashing against the window panes.
Right.
Maybe a few loose shingles are even being violently ripped off the roof and thrown into the garden. Now, in the world of psychiatry, that storm, that fluctuating, dramatic, frankly terrifying weather, is what we typically think of as psychiatric symptoms.
Acute crisis.
Exactly. A sudden, crushing panic attack, a profound depressive episode, or, a terrifying auditory hallucination.
Yeah.
It is the immediate crisis, the torrential rain, that obviously demands our urgent attention.
Because it's so visible.
Right. But if you only look at the weather, you are missing the most fundamental part of the picture. You have to look at the house itself.
The structure.
Yes, you have to examine the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the structural integrity that actually determines whether that building is going to weather the storm or completely collapse under the pressure.
And that architecture, in this metaphor, is your personality.
Spot on. It is the enduring structure of how you perceive reality, how you regulate your emotions, and, well, how you form relationships across your entire life. So today, we are not just looking at the weather.
No. We're inspecting the foundation.
Exactly. We are going to inspect the foundation of the house.
And that architectural metaphor really captures the core of what we are unpacking today. I mean, if we are going to understand mental health in any meaningful way, we have to start with a guiding philosophy for this deep dive.
Which is?
Psychiatry is the study of how brain, mind, and experience interact, and crucially, how that process can go wrong.
Right, the interaction is the key.
Yeah, because symptoms tell us what has happened in the immediate moment, but personality helps explain why it is happening in the first place and how that specific individual is going to experience and react to it.
Because everyone reacts differently.
Absolutely. Two people can have the exact same storm, an identical depressive episode. But because their houses are built differently, the way they cope, the way they seek help, and how they recover will be completely distinct.
So we are pulling our structural blueprints today from Kaplan and Sadek's comprehensive textbook of psychiatry.
The absolute gold standard.
It really is, and we're specifically looking at how adults are assessed. We're focusing on this because, frankly, the science of measuring a human mind is wilder, more complex, and much more rigorous than you might think.
It's not what people see on social media.
Oh, definitely not. This isn't about those online quizzes that tell you which type of bread matches your aura or whatever.
Right, no Sunday supplement quizzes here.
We are looking at the empirical systematic measurement of human psychology. We want to clarify the actual mechanisms behind clinical tests and really strengthen clinical reasoning.
We want to understand how psychiatrists and psychologists actually sit down and map out the human soul, essentially. And doing that requires a journey. We have to move from the underlying maths of psychometrics to the clinical manifestations we actually see when a patient sits in the testing room, and finally to the clinical meaning.
How it all comes together in practice.
Right. How do psychiatrists take this raw data and use it to make life-altering treatment decisions for their patients? Because the stakes here are incredibly high.
They really are.
We use these tests to diagnose severe mental illness, to guide intensive psychotherapy, and even to determine outcomes in the criminal justice system.
But, okay, I have to push back right out of the gate here.
Go for it.
If personality is, as we were saying, the enduring architecture of the mind, it is also completely invisible.
Yeah.
You cannot put someone's coping mechanisms under a microscope. You can't take an MRI of their self-esteem or their tendency to hold a grudge.
You definitely cannot.
So how on earth do we measure something so abstract without just relying on a clinician's subjective opinion, or worse, just pure guesswork?
Well, you have hit on the fundamental diagnostic dilemma of the entire field right there. And solving that dilemma leads us directly into the science of measurement, which we call psychometrics.
Okay, psychometric.
Yeah. Before we can even attempt to measure personality, we have to define it with immense strictness. According to the psychiatric framework we are using, personality is defined as an individual's enduring and pervasive motivations, emotions, interpersonal skills, attitudes, and traits.
Enduring and pervasive being the operative words, I imagine.
Exactly. We're not measuring how irritable you are on a Tuesday afternoon after missing your train and having a terrible cup of coffee.
Which would be very irritable, for the record.
Right, but that's just a fleeting mood. We are measuring how you operate across years, across completely different stressful situations, and across different relationships.
So the systematic empirical measurement of those pervasive traits is the purview of personality assessment. But as I mentioned, the quality of these tests varies wildly. On one end of the spectrum, you have highly validated clinical instruments used in high court. And on the other, you have what the literature brilliantly calls the Sunday supplement psychological tests you find in a magazine.
Which are practically useless clinically.
So how does a clinician actually know they are using a rigorous tool and not just a glorified parlor trick?
Well, a psychologist shouldn't ever administer a test without consulting the Burroughs Mental Measurement Yearbook.
Burroughs.
Yeah. You can conceptualize it as the physician's desk reference or the definitive formulary, but for psychological testing.
Oh, that's a great way to think about it.
It is this massive, continuously updated reference source containing intensely critical reviews of individual tests by independent experts in the field.
So it's essentially peer review for the tests themselves.
It is the ultimate safeguard. It evaluates the scientific underpinnings of every single instrument, the reliability, the validity, the specific normative groups used in its construction, and the empirical studies that actually back it all up.
It leaves nothing to chance.
Right. It details the advantages, the disadvantages, and the highly specific clinical situations for using the test. It basically prevents the field of psychology from descending into pseudoscience.
Which is a very real risk.
Absolutely. If an instrument hasn't passed muster in Burroughs, it simply has no place in a serious clinical assessment.
Let's actually break down those scientific underpinnings then, because the mechanics of how these tests are built is fascinating.
It really is.
Let's start with the normative sample. If I decide tomorrow that I want to create a brand new test to measure, say, social anxiety, I can't just go to a local university clinic, test 40 undergraduates who happen to have social anxiety, average their scores, and call it a day, right?
Testing 40 people in one location is virtually useless for building a standardized diagnostic test.
Because it's too narrow?
Because human behavior is wildly contextual. There are far too many moderating factors that impact how people answer psychological questions.
What?
Age, formal education level, sex, racial and ethnic grouping, geographic region, urban versus rural upbringing. All of these variables fundamentally alter baseline responses.
Ah, I see.
So if your entire sample is university students, your test might identify normal adult behavior in a 50-year-old tradesman as pathological, simply because he doesn't answer questions like a 20-year-old student.
That makes total sense. To give you a concrete sense of the sheer scale required to do this properly, I was reading about the restandardization of the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI-2.
The heavyweight champion of these tests.
Yeah, exactly. When they built the modern normative sample for that, they didn't just grab a few dozen people from a waiting room. They initially recruited about 2,900 subjects from across the country.
A huge undertaking.
And they ended up throwing out about 300 of them because of invalid, inconsistent, or incomplete data. So they were left with a final, pristine group of 2,600 community volunteers, roughly 1,460 women and 1,140 men.
And they didn't pick them randomly either.
No, they used national census data as a strict guide. They had to make sure the group was broadly representative across different regions, racial compositions, age brackets, and income levels to actually match the population.
And just consider the logistical nightmare and immense expense of doing that before the internet age.
Right. Sending out booklets, tabulating it all by hand.
And yet, even with all that incredible effort, the literature notes that the MMPI-2 normative sample was still slightly overrepresentative in higher education levels compared to the national average.
Which just shows how hard it is to get it perfect.
It highlights how enormously difficult it is to obtain true census-based normative samples. But this effort is absolutely essential.
Because otherwise the numbers mean nothing.
Precisely. When a patient takes a personality test today, their raw score of, say, 45 on a depression scale is completely meaningless in a vacuum. The number 45 tells us nothing.
It's just a number.
It only gains clinical meaning when we compare it to that meticulously constructed normative sample of 2,600 people to see how far our patient's score deviates from the expected normal performance.
So we have a good normative sample. We know what normal looks like across the population. The next major structural hurdle for our metaphorical house is reliability.
Yes, reliability.
And the absolute bedrock of reliability is consistency.
Consistency is everything in measurement. If a test is reliable, an individual should obtain the same or a statistically very similar score, if they're given the same test again under similar circumstances.
Right.
Imagine a patient with a deeply entrenched, stable fear of open spaces agoraphobia. They take your new test on Monday and score off the charts for anxiety.
Okay.
But they take it again on Wednesday and score perfectly normal, despite having received zero treatment and experiencing absolutely no change in their actual condition.
That test is bouncing all over the place.
Exactly. It is clinically useless because it has poor reliability.
How did the developers actually prove that consistency mathematically? Because there are a few different mechanisms, starting with test-retest reliability.
Test-retest is the most straightforward concept. You administer the exact same test on 2 separate occasions to a large group of subjects, and you statistically correlate the results.
So you just look at how closely the 2 sets of scores match.
Yes. For a test to be considered clinically viable and stable, the correlation coefficient should be at least 0.80.
Okay, 0.80.
Assuming the test is administered within a short window, like 2 weeks, and the underlying trait being measured is actually a stable personality trait and not a fleeting mood.
But wait, humans have memories?
We do.
What if taking the test the first time fundamentally changes how you take it the second time? If I take a 500-question test, I might remember some of the tricky questions, go home, overthink them, and answer differently a week later just because I'm second-guessing myself.
That is a very real phenomenon known as practice effect, or testing effect.
So how do you fix that?
To circumvent that, developers create what is called parallel form reliability. They build 2 separate versions of the test form A and form B.
Ah, clever.
Both forms are engineered to measure the exact same theoretical construct, let's say impulsivity, but they use completely different questions to do so.
So it feels like a new test to the patient.
Right. Form A might ask if you buy things on a whim, while Form B asks if you frequently interrupt people. To ensure they are truly measuring the same underlying architecture, the statistical correlation between the 2 parallel forms needs to be exceptionally high, often 0.90 or higher.
That makes perfect sense. Now, what if you don't have the luxury of giving 2 tests? I mean, time is money in a clinic. What about internal consistency reliability? This is where I found the maths to be really elegant.
Internal consistency doesn't require a second administration at all. It asks whether the different parts of the single test are reliably measuring the same thing at the same time.
Like checking the structural integrity of different walls in the same house.
Exactly. The classic method is split half reliability. You literally divide the test into 2 equal halves. You might correlate the score from the first half of the test with the score from the second half.
Or odd and even numbers, right?
Right. More commonly, you correlate all the odd-numbered items with all the even-numbered items.
But I see a mathematical trap here.
Let's hear it.
If you split a 100-question test in half, you are now effectively evaluating the reliability of a 50-question instrument. And in psychometrics, the sheer number of items directly influences the strength of the correlation.
Absolutely it does.
A longer test is generally a more stable test. So splitting it down the middle feels like cutting a yardstick in half and expecting it to measure a room with the same accuracy. It statistically underestimates the true reliability of the full test.
That is a superb deduction. It is a statistical artifact.
Yeah.
The split half correlation gives you an artificially low number.
So how do they correct that?
To correct for this mathematical underestimation, statisticians apply something called the Spearman-Brown formula.
Spearman-Brown formula.
Yes. It essentially extrapolates the data and mathematically restores the reliability estimate to what it would be for the full-length test. And again, you are looking for a reliability coefficient of 0.8, 0 to 0.85 to demonstrate that the internal structure is sound.
Are there other ways to measure that internal consistency?
Alternatively, modern developers heavily rely on Cronbach's coefficient alpha.
Right, I saw that mentioned constantly.
It's everywhere. It is a formula that determines the average correlation among all the items on the test simultaneously.
So it's looking at everything all at once.
Exactly. Now, no psychological test is perfectly reliable. A 1.0 is a perfect identical correlation, which just doesn't exist in human behavior, and 0 is entirely random noise.
Yeah.
But the closer that alpha gets to 1.0, the tighter the internal consistency.
This brings us to a concept that I think is crucial for anyone interpreting these tests to understand: the standard error of measurement, or the SEM. To stick with our architectural metaphor, the SEM is the structural margin of error built into the blueprints.
Every single reputable test manual must publish its standard error of measurement. It is a single vital statistic that estimates what a given patient's score would be if they took the exact same test an infinite number of times.
Because there's always going to be some variation.
Right. It quantifies the inherent wobble or imprecision that exists in any psychological measurement.
Let me put some real numbers to this to make it concrete. Let's say a patient comes into your clinic, takes a personality test today, and gets a raw score of 90 for depression.
Okay, and 90.
You flip open the Burroughs manual and you see the CCM for this specific test is 3. What does that actually tell you as a clinician?
What gives you a range?
Exactly. It means that if that exact same patient takes the test again tomorrow, they will score within one sim, meaning plus or minus 3 points about 68% of the time.
Right.
Therefore, you can be 68% statistically confident that their true underlying score lies somewhere between 87 and 93.
And in clinical practice, 68% confidence often isn't enough when you are making major diagnostic decisions.
You want to be more certain.
Absolutely. If you want to be highly confident, you double the SAM. Yeah. They will score within 2 SEM values. So plus or minus 6 points 95% of the time.
So 95% of the time, their true score is between 84 and 96.
Correct. As a psychiatrist or psychologist, you have to keep this range constantly in your mind. A psychological score of 90 isn't an absolute binary fact like a fractured femur on an X-ray.
It's not just a hard line.
It is a statistical probability range. Other things being equal, the smaller the SEM relative to the standard deviation of the test, the sharper and more clinically useful the instrument is.
Right. So we have a consistent, reliable test with a known margin of error. But here's the catch. Consistency does not mean it is actually correct.
A very important distinction.
I could own a highly reliable heavy-duty tape measure, but if the factory printed the inches slightly too close together, it is going to be consistently wrong every single time I use it.
Beautiful analogy.
That brings us to the ultimate, most important question in psychometrics. Validity. Does the test actually measure the psychological construct it purports to measure?
Validity is the absolute most critical characteristic in evaluating the scientific merit of any assessment. And it is incredibly complex because we are trying to measure invisible theoretical constructs. Things like self-esteem, hostility, or latent psychosis.
You can't just put a ruler up to latent psychosis.
No, you cannot. The test developer first has to operationally define what the trait even is, which is much harder than it sounds. Then they have to scientifically prove the test measures it by satisfying several different compounding layers of validity.
Let's walk through those layers because they build on each other. First, we have face validity and logical content validity.
Face validity is the simplest layer. It asks, do the test items appear on their surface to measure the construct?
Does it pass the eye test?
Exactly. If you are taking a depression scale, does it ask questions about persistent sadness, early morning awakening, or feelings of worthlessness?
Seems obvious enough.
It does. But the glaring problem is that face validity is entirely subjective. One psychologist might look at an item about overeating and think it measures depression. Another might think it measures anxiety.
So you need something more rigorous.
To fix this subjectivity, developers use logical content validity. They don't rely on one person's gut feeling. They use a documented, formalized procedure.
For instance, when researchers were developing the Taylor Manifest Anxiety Scale, they didn't just brainstorm questions over coffee.
No, they did not.
They had a large group of independent, credentialed psychologists review a massive pool of items, and they only included the items that the majority agreed perfectly matched a formal, rigorous definition of manifest anxiety. It relies on strict expert consensus rather than individual subjectivity.
But, and this is a big but, even expert consensus isn't enough to prove a test works in the real world.
Because experts can be collectively wrong.
Precisely. Which leads us to the most vital layer, criterion and construct validity. This is where we demand proof from outside the test itself.
Let's say I invent a brand new test designed to measure severe hypochondria. I have great internal consistency. My experts all agree the questions look great. How do I actually prove it works? I can't just ask other doctors if they like the questions.
You have to look at objective reality. You use an external criterion. You track a large cohort of patients who score very high on your new hypochondria test. Then you look at their actual lives.
What are they actually doing?
Exactly. Do these high-scoring patients actually have significantly more visits to their general practitioner's office than low-scoring patients? Do they complain of a higher sheer volume of physical symptoms?
Are they demanding more scans?
Right. Do their medical records show they consume vastly more prescribed and over-the-counter medications? If their high test scores mathematically correlate with those external, objective, real-world behaviors, then your test has demonstrated criterion validity.
And by extension, it has construct validity. It is successfully measuring the theoretical construct of hypochondria that it set out to measure.
Yes. And the timing of that external data matters immensely, too. We have concurrent validity versus predictive validity.
Let's break those down.
Concurrent validity looks at the present moment. Do the high scorers on your hypochondria test currently have more doctor visits this month than the low scorers? That is relatively easy to measure.
Because it's happening right now.
But predictive validity, however, is the holy grail, and it is notoriously difficult to establish. It asks if the test can accurately predict future long-term events.
The literature gives a great example of this. Imagine a test designed to predict long-term marital satisfaction among engaged couples.
A fascinating concept.
Right. To actually prove predictive validity for that instrument, you have to test the couples right now while they are engaged, and then you have to painstakingly track them down 5, 10, or 15 years later to obtain the external criterion.
To see if they actually stay together.
Exactly. Their actual future marital status, divorce rates, and self-reported satisfaction.
Because longitudinal data of that nature is so incredibly difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to obtain, true predictive validity is relatively rare in personality tests, but it is incredibly valuable when it exists.
And we also need discriminant validity, which is vital for differential diagnosis. A good test shouldn't just flag everyone as sick.
Right, it needs to be specific.
Can your new depression inventory statistically discriminate between a healthy subject, a patient suffering from a mild adjustment disorder after losing a job, and a patient in the depths of a severe major depressive episode? It has to be able to tease apart the nuances.
Absolutely.
Finally, we have to talk about factor validity because this gets into the actual architecture of the test itself.
Factor validity utilizes a highly complex, multivariate statistical technique called factor analysis. Think of it as a mathematical sorting algorithm. It looks at the massive pool of thousands of patient answers and asks, do certain major groups of items empirically cluster together on their own?
I always think of factor analysis like sorting a massive pile of laundry.
Oh, I like that.
You throw 500 random questions into a pile, and the maths automatically groups the socks with the socks and the shirts with the shirts. It looks to see if all the I can't sleep questions naturally clump together with the I have no energy questions.
That is a superb analogy. On a depression test, the factor analysis should empirically show that all the questions regarding vegetative symptoms, sleep, appetite, psychomotor retardation, statistically cover.
They move together.
Yes. And it should show that the items about severe cognitive problems, like poor concentration or guilt, form a distinct, separate cluster from the items about social withdrawal. Factor validity ensures that the internal mathematical structure of the test actually matches the complex, multifaceted clinical reality of the disorder as we see it in patients.
So if we step back, what does this all mean for the clinician? It means that once we have these rigorous statistical tools, our census-matched normative samples, our Spearman-Brown reliability coefficients, our SEM margins of error, and our multi-layered validity proofs, we can finally start building actual usable diagnostic instruments.
The tools of the trade.
Right. But this raises a profound psychological question. If I want to know about your deepest flaws, your paranoias, your hostilities, do I just ask you outright? Or do I have to trick you into revealing them? This leads us directly into the mechanics of objective testing.
Objective personality tests are the absolute workhorses of psychological assessment. They operate on a very straightforward, transparent mechanism. They ask specific, standard questions in a highly structured format, usually true-false, or a multi-point Likert rating scale.
Strongly agree, strongly disagree, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Every single patient gets the exact same questions, in the exact same order, in the exact same way. The responses are scored objectively against agreed-upon criteria compared to those massive normative tables we just discussed and converted into standardized scores.
The literature specifically highlights the use of uniform scores. This is a mathematical conversion that standardizes the percentiles so that a score of 65 on one scale, say anxiety, is roughly equivalent in statistical severity to a score of 65 on a completely different scale, like paranoia.
It creates a common currency.
Exactly. It allows clinicians to compare apples to oranges on the same profile sheet. And while there are hundreds of objective tests floating around, we have to talk about the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2, the MMPI-2.
The MMPI-2 is the most researched, most validated, and most widely utilized objective personality assessment instrument in human history.
It's ubiquitous.
It really is.
Yeah.
It has over 12,000 peer-reviewed articles and books published on it, and it has been translated into over 115 languages. It's a massive undertaking for a patient, though. 567 true-false questions.
567, that's a marathon.
It generally takes an hour to an hour and a half to complete, and it requires about an 8th grade reading comprehension level to ensure the patient actually understands what they are endorsing.
I want to spend some time on how the MMPI was actually built because the mechanism here, a process called empirical keying, is utterly fascinating and completely counterintuitive.
It really bucked the trend of how things were done.
Right. Back in the late 1930s and 1940s, when Stark Hathaway and J.C. McKinley developed the original clinical scales at the University of Minnesota, they didn't just sit in a room, brainstorm what a depressed person might say, and write questions based on their clinical intuition.
No, they rejected clinical intuition entirely. They used empirical keying, which is purely, ruthlessly data-driven.
How does that actually work?
They generated a massive tool of hundreds of random statements, ranging from physical symptoms to political beliefs to random hobbies. They gave this huge list of statements to a control group of about 1,500 normal individuals, mostly hospital visitors and local workers.
Okay, establishing the baseline.
Then, they gave the exact same list to specific, carefully diagnosed groups of psychiatric patients, usually containing at least 50 subjects per group. A group of patients with schizophrenia, a group with clinical depression, a group of known hypochondriacs.
And here is the genius part. They then looked purely at the statistics to find the questions that differentiated the groups. It didn't matter if the question made logical, intuitive sense to a psychiatrist.
Not at all.
If the clinical group answered it statistically differently than the normal control group, that question stayed on the scale.
Exactly. A question like, I enjoy reading mechanics magazines, might not seem like it has anything to do with mental illness.
Right. It sounds totally random.
But if 80% of the depressed patients answer false, and only 20% of the normal group answer false, that item becomes a scientifically valid marker for depression on that specific test. It is entirely empirical.
The historical examples of this are mind-blowing. Look at Scale 4, which was originally called psychopathic deviancy. They didn't build this scale by going to a maximum security prison and testing hardened, violent, psychopathic serial killers.
No, the normative clinical group for Scale 4 was quite nuanced. It consisted of young adults and psychiatric patients who had normal intelligence and who completely lacked any serious neurotic or psychotic symptoms.
They weren't hallucinating. They weren't crippled by anxiety.
Right. But they had continual disruptive run-ins with authority. They exhibited social maladjustment and delinquent act stealing, chronic lying, excessive drinking, sexual promiscuity, absent-minded rebellion.
Which is way more common.
It captured a very specific clinical picture of someone who refuses to conform to social norms, which is far more common in a clinical setting than a cinematic serial killer.
Or look at Scale 7, psychothenia. We don't even use that diagnostic term in modern psychiatry anymore. It sounds incredibly antiquated.
It does sound like something from the 19th century.
Right, but the scale was built empirically on patients who worried excessively, who were plagued by major fears, compulsions, rituals, guilt, and generalized distress. The empirical cluster they found perfectly mapped to what we would today diagnose as severe obsessive-compulsive disorder blended with generalized anxiety.
But as the decades passed, a major historical pivot occurred that shows how psychiatry constantly evolves and corrects itself.
Which was,
Well, the original clinicians in the 40s and 50s used the actual diagnostic names for these scales. If you spiked on scale 6, they said you had paranoia. If you spiked on scale 8, they said you had schizophrenia. But they quickly realized this created a massive problem with false positives.
right, because human pathology isn't clean. A patient diagnosed with severe schizophrenia doesn't just neatly elevate on the schizophrenia scale and score 0 on everything else.
Exactly. They are suffering immensely.
So they might score highly on the depression scale because their life is falling apart, highly on the paranoia scale because of their delusions, and highly on the psychasthenia scale because they are terrified. The schizophrenia scale might just be their highest peak among a mountain of distress.
So if a clinician blindly diagnosed everyone who spiked on scale 8 as having schizophrenia, they would be medically wrong a significant portion of the time.
So the field made a brilliant, pragmatic adjustment. They formally stripped the diagnostic names away and replaced them with numbers 0 through 9. They stopped looking at isolated single scales and started looking at the overall configuration of the test known as code types.
This shifted the entire focus to profile analysis. If a patient takes the MMPI-2 and their highest score is scale 1, which originally measured hypochondriasis, and their second highest elevation is scale 2 depression, clinicians don't diagnose them with those two separate things.
They call that a 1-2 code type.
Exactly. And empirically, through decades of research, we know that a 1-2 code type presents with a very specific set of clinical manifestations. Often chronic pain patients who have developed secondary depression, who are highly resistant to psychological insight, and who somaticize their emotional distress.
That clinical picture might be entirely different from a patient who just elevates on scale 2 alone.
It forces the clinician to look at the complex interaction of the traits.
But all of this brilliant empirical keying and profile analysis relies on one massive, glaring assumption.
That the patient is telling the truth.
Yes, that the patient sitting in the room, filling out 567 questions, is actually telling the truth. And that is the elephant in the room. What if they are actively trying to manipulate the outcome?
It happens all the time.
What if you are testing a defendant who is trying to look incredibly sick, hallucinating, and psychotic to get out of a severe criminal charge? Or, conversely, what if you are testing a parent in a bitter custody dispute who is trying to look perfectly sane, hiding their severe alcoholism and explosive anger to get custody of their children? How do we catch the liars, the deniers, and the manipulators?
This is the true, unparalleled genius of the MMPI-2. It doesn't just measure psychiatric pathology. It has intricate built-in mechanisms to measure the patient's test-taking attitude.
The validity scales.
Yes. The test developers assumed that patients approach the true-false bubbles the exact same way they approach a face-to-face clinical interview. Some patients are painfully honest, some are highly guarded, some are actively deceitful, and some just lack total self-insight. To capture this, the MMPI-2 uses highly sophisticated validity scales.
We need to detail these validity scales because they are absolute clinical gold. First, there's the L scale, historically known as the lie scale. But this isn't about catching grand Machiavellian deceptions. It's much more subtle. It's about naive defensiveness.
The L scale consists of 15 items designed to measure general frankness and a person's willingness to admit minor flaws. The items describe minor personal frailties or common human shortcomings that are universally true of everyone, but are slightly socially undesirable to admit.
Like what?
For example, endorsing the statement, "I have never failed to tell the truth," or answering false to, "I do not always tell the truth."
Because everyone lies occasionally.
Every single human being lies occasionally. Every human gets angry sometimes. If a patient scores very high on the L scale, they're either remarkably psychologically naive or they're being extremely defensive. They are trying to present themselves as a practically flawless saint.
So what does that mean for their profile?
When a clinician sees an elevated L scale, it immediately tells them that the rest of the clinical profile, the depression, the anxiety, the hostility, is likely suppressed. The patient is underreporting their true pathology to look good.
Then we have the absolute opposite approach, the F scale or infrequency scale. This one is heavy. It consists of 60 items that 10% or fewer of the normal population endorse.
The items on the F scale represent highly bizarre, atypical, or extreme psychological experiences. The literature gives the example of endorsing a statement like, "Evil spirits possess me at times," or "Most any time I would rather sit and daydream than do anything else." Now, imagine you are the psychiatrist. A patient hands you their MMPI-2 results, and their F scale is absolutely maxed out. They've endorsed almost every bizarre item on the test. You are faced with a critical interpretive fork in the road.
Right, because there are two very different reasons someone might do that.
Exactly two. Either this patient is suffering from incredibly severe acute psychopathology, they are actively psychotic, overwhelmed by hallucinations and delusions and crying out for help, or, and this is crucial in forensic settings, they are intentionally malingering. They are faking bad. They're endorsing every crazy-sounding symptom they can find to try and convince you they are insane.
And how do you mathematically know which it is?
You have to rely on context and statistical base rates. As the psychiatric literature explicitly states, base rates differ entirely depending on the setting.
So the setting changes the interpretation.
Drastically. If you see a massive F-scale elevation in a patient undergoing a court-ordered sanity evaluation who is facing 20 years in prison, the statistical base rate for symptom magnification and malingering is incredibly high. The test is flagging them as a probable fake.
Right.
However, if you see that exact same F-scale elevation in a patient voluntarily walking into an emergency room or a community outpatient clinic, the probability shifts heavily toward genuine severe illness. The test itself doesn't make the final definitive judgment. It acts as an alarm bell, alerting the clinician to a profound statistical anomaly that must be investigated.
And there is one more validity scale I want to highlight because it's so incredibly clever in its design. The VRIN, or Variable Response Inconsistency Scale. It catches people who aren't even reading the questions, people who are just bubbling in answers randomly because they are bored, uncooperative, or severely cognitively impaired.
The VRIN consists of 67 pairs of items spread throughout the test. The test asks the exact same concept in two slightly different ways, separated by hundreds of questions.
It's basically a consistency check.
Exactly. The textbook provides a perfect example of this mechanism. Question 40 might be, I sleep very poorly at night. Question 420 might be, I wake up fully refreshed each morning.
And if they say true to both.
If a patient answers true to both of those statements, that is logically and biologically impossible. It reflects severe internal inconsistency.
So you basically have to throw the entire test in the bin at that point.
Quite right. If a patient's VREN score rises too high, it invalidates the entire 567-item test. You throw the results in the bin because the patient wasn't actually reading or comprehending the questions.
It's like having a highly calibrated polygraph machine built directly into the DNA of the personality test.
It is brilliant.
Now, the MMPI-2 is magnificent, but it is fundamentally based on the old categorical model of psychiatry, the idea of putting people into specific diagnostic boxes like schizophrenia or depression. But modern psychiatry is evolving rapidly, and the DSM-5 introduced an alternative dimensional model of personality. To measure that new paradigm, developers built a newer tool, the Personality Inventory for DSM-5, or the PID-5.
The shift from categorical to dimensional modeling is a profound evolution in clinical reasoning. The authors of the DSM-5 finally formally acknowledge what clinicians have known for decades. Categorical personality disorder diagnoses are often messy, confusing, and highly overlapping.
Yeah, people rarely fit neatly into one box.
Exactly. A patient in your clinic might have severe traits of borderline personality disorder, traits of narcissistic personality disorder, and traits of antisocial personality disorder, but they might not quite meet the strict, rigid threshold of 5 out of 9 criteria for any single one of those boxes.
So what did they get diagnosed with in the old system?
In the old system, they would receive a frustrating, clinically useless diagnosis of personality disorder not otherwise specified.
Which tells the next doctor absolutely nothing about how to treat them.
Precisely. The Section 3 alternative dimensional model argues that personality pathology isn't about being neatly sorted into a box. It's about having extreme, inflexible, maladaptive expressions of normal personality traits.
And the PID-5 is the specific instrument built to map that dimensional space. It is a 220-item self-report inventory. It uses a 4-point Likert scale, ranging from very false or often false to very true or often true. And instead of spitting out a diagnosis at the end, it gives you a raw score across 5 broad domains of personality.
Those 5 broad domains are crucial to understand as they represent the highest level of personality organization in this model. Negative affect, which is how frequently and intensely you experience negative emotions. Detachment, your tendency to withdraw from social interactions.
Right.
Antagonism behaviors that put you at odds with others, like grandiosity or deceitfulness. Disinhibition, impulsivity, and failure to plan ahead. And psychoticism, experiencing the world in bizarre, eccentric ways.
But it goes deeper than just those 5.
It does. The true clinical power of the PID-5 is that it doesn't stop at those 5 broad categories. Underneath those domains, it measures 25 highly specific trait facets.
Things like anhedonia, callousness, emotional lability, grandiosity, impulsivity, risk-taking, and rigid perfectionism. Higher scores indicate greater dysfunction in that highly specific area.
So consider how this changes the language of psychiatry. Instead of a clinician writing a note that says, this patient has borderline personality disorder, which carries immense stigma and relies on a rigid box, they might write, this patient shows severe dysfunction in the broad domains of negative affect and disinhibition.
Which is much more descriptive.
Exactly. Specifically, this is characterized by extreme elevations in the facets of emotional lability, impulsivity, and separation insecurity.
It paints a much higher resolution, highly individualized blueprint of the patient's specific psychological architecture. You know exactly what the structural weaknesses of the house are.
Exactly. Its major strength is that it is directly, natively tied to this new DSM-5 alternative model. It represents the cutting edge of how we conceptualize personality.
But it has limitations, right? The textbook mentions a few.
It does. Compared to the MMPI-2, which has 80 years of exhaustive research and millions of data points, the PID-5 is in its absolute infancy. The available longitudinal research is limited, and we don't fully know the inter-rater reliability among practicing clinicians yet. It hasn't been battle-tested in forensic courts the way the MMPI has, but it undeniably represents the future trajectory of the field.
Before we move away from objective tests entirely, the text briefly outlines a few other major instruments in Table 7.51 that we should at least touch upon, just to demonstrate the breadth of the clinical arsenal. There is the MCMI-3, the Millen Clinical Multiaxial Inventory.
The MCMI-3 is significantly shorter than the MMPI, clocking in at about 175 items and taking only 30 to 45 minutes. Its major advantage is that its scales were explicitly designed to correspond directly to the specific personality disorders outlined in the DSM.
So it's very targeted.
If you want to know if someone has avoidant personality disorder, the MCMI has a scale for that. However, the text issues a strong warning. Because there's a high degree of item overlap between the various scales, meaning the same question counts toward multiple different diagnoses, the test has a known statistical tendency to overdiagnose pathology.
Then there is the PAI, the Personality Assessment Inventory. This one is 344 items.
The PAI is becoming increasingly popular in modern clinics. It has 11 clinical scales that are somewhat similar to the MMPI-2, but it adds very practical, highly specific treatment-related scales.
What kind of scales?
It assesses things like acute suicide ideation, potential for aggression, and treatment rejection, meaning how likely is this patient to actually engage in therapy or just storm out? A major psychometric strength of the PAI is that its scales are completely non-overlapping, which avoids the overdiagnosis problem of the MCMI.
And finally, the Neo-PIR, which is based on the famous five-factor model of personality, the Big Five: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism.
A classic.
But as we look at this entire arsenal, the MMPI, the PID-5, the PAI, they all share one fundamental, inescapable limitation. They all rely completely on the patient being consciously aware of their own traits and being willing to report them accurately.
And that is a massive clinical vulnerability.
Right. What if the patient is lying to themselves? What if their psychological defense mechanisms are so robust they're hiding their hostility or their trauma from their own conscious awareness? The MMPI can't catch a genuine blind spot if the patient truly believes they are fine. How do you measure something the patient isn't even aware they possess?
To do that, you have to bypass their conscious defenses entirely. You take away the rigid structure of true-false questions. You force them into ambiguity. And this takes us into the most mysterious, heavily debated, and deeply psychoanalytic corner of psychometrics: projective assessments.
The ink blots and such.
Exactly. If objective tests are highly structured, direct, and transparent, projective tests are deliberately unstructured, indirect, and opaque. The instructions given to the patient are intentionally vague. Crucially, the patient has absolutely no idea how their answers will be scored, which makes it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for them to consciously fake or manipulate the results.
The psychological mechanism driving this is called the projective hypothesis. Can you explain how this actually works?
Let's go back to our house analogy. Objective testing is handing the patient a clipboard and a checklist, and asking them to walk around and rate the structural integrity of their own house.
Okay, straightforward.
Projective testing is entirely different. It is walking the patient into a completely empty, pitch-black room, shining a single flashlight onto a blank white wall, and asking them to describe what they see. The room is objectively empty. Therefore, whatever complex scene they describe seeing on that wall, they must be projecting outward from their own internal architecture.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
The underlying psychological assumption is that when a human being is presented with an ambiguous, unstructured stimulus like an ink blot or a vague photograph, their brain is forced to organize that ambiguity to make sense of it. And in the process of organizing it, they inevitably project their own unconscious needs, repressed thoughts, latent conflicts, and their unique way of processing reality onto that blank screen.
I love the analogy Arthur Carr made in an earlier edition of the textbook. He pointed out that William Shakespeare understood the projective hypothesis hundreds of years before psychiatrists ever named it.
In Hamlet.
Yes, in Hamlet. When the prince is trying to feign insanity to confuse Polonius, he looks up at a completely random cloud formation and starts associating bizarre images with it. A camel, a weasel, a whale. That cloud was the original projective test. Hamlet was projecting his internal state onto an ambiguous stimulus.
A wonderful, deeply accurate literary analogy. And the most famous, iconic modern equivalent of Hamlet's clouds is, without question, the Rorschach test. Developed around 1910 by the brilliant Swiss psychiatrist Hermann Rorschach, it remains the most frequently used projective instrument in the world.
And what are the materials?
The material itself is simple. It consists of 10 standard, symmetrical, bilaterally identical ink blots, some purely black and white, some incorporating red, and some fully colored printed on heavy cardboard cards.
The administration of the Rorschach, however, is anything but simple, particularly when using John E. Exner's comprehensive system, which brought statistical rigor to the test in the 1970s. The setup is almost cinematic in its rigidity. It is a highly controlled clinical environment designed to minimize any influence from the examiner.
Yes. To maintain absolute standardization, the interpersonal interaction between the examiner and the patient is kept to a strict minimum. The examiner sits slightly behind or beside the patient to avoid giving nonverbal cues.
Like nodding or smiling.
Exactly. No leading the witness. They hand the patient card IA and give a single, very simple standard prompt. What might this be? Then the examiner remains silent and writes down verbatim, word for word, absolutely everything the patient says. This is known as the free association phase.
They write down everything.
Everything. The examiner notes every sigh, every hesitation. If the patient rotates the card, the examiner notes the exact angle of rotation and the timing of when they did it.
So they just let them talk?
For the first pass, yes. They let the patient's unconscious mind wander across all 10 cards. But the free association is just the setup. The real, rigorous clinical work happens immediately after in what is called the inquiry phase.
Once the patient has looked at all 10 cards, the examiner doesn't just say thank you and let them leave. The examiner goes all the way back to card I. They read the patient's exact words back to them, and they ask 2 critical questions. Help me see what you saw, and what made it look like that?
The inquiry phase is essential for scoring. The clinician isn't just interested in what the patient saw, a bat, a butterfly, 2 bears fighting. That is content, and it's only one piece of the puzzle. The examiner needs to know exactly where on the blot they saw it, and crucially, what specific determinants caused them to see it.
And the scoring systems for these determinants are immensely elaborate. You are looking at location. Did the patient use the entire massive blot to form their image, which might indicate a sweeping, big-picture cognitive style? Or did they focus obsessively on a tiny, minuscule detail in the corner, missing the obvious whole, which might indicate severe anxiety or an obsessive-compulsive need for control? You are looking at determinants. Was it purely the shape of the ink that influenced them? Or was it the red color that made them see blood? Was it the subtle shading that made them see a dark, threatening storm cloud?
And Exner's comprehensive system takes all of these hundreds of tiny data points, the locations, the colors, the shapes, the movement, and runs them through complex algorithms to produce cluster variables.
What do those clusters tell us?
Well, the textbook provides a fascinating table of these clusters. For instance, consider the cluster called cognitive mediation.
What exactly does cognitive mediation measure in the context of an ink blot?
It assesses how the patient translates raw visual data into concepts. Are their perceptions conventional, or are there severe pathological reality distortions?
Give me an example.
Let's say a patient looks at a specific area of card 8 that 95% of the normal population easily identifies as a 4-legged animal, like a bear or a dog. But your patient insists it is a bleeding piece of alien machinery, and they base that entirely on a tiny speck of red ink, ignoring the obvious shape of the animal.
That's a huge leap.
It is. That indicates a profound distortion in how they process reality. They are ignoring conventional reality in favor of idiosyncratic, bizarre internal logic. In a clinical setting, severe deficits in cognitive mediation heavily point towards a primary thought disorder, such as schizophrenia.
Other clusters measure different architectures. Control stress tolerance measures their psychological capacity to handle pressure without fragmenting. Affective features measure how they modulate intense emotions like anger or depression. Do they respond to the colored cards with explosive, disorganized imagery, or do they integrate the colors smoothly?
It's remarkably detailed.
But I have to play devil's advocate here. The Rorschach is not without intense controversy. The textbook is very transparent about this. Because of limited, highly debated scientific support regarding the test-retest reliability of certain specific measures within the system, some modern graduate psychology programs no longer even teach the Rorschach. It is often viewed by empiricists as a relic.
It's a highly debated instrument. Critics argue it is too subjective. However, defenders of the Rorschach point out that when scored strictly using the Exner system, its validity for identifying psychosis, assessing intelligence, and predicting certain outcomes is actually quite robust.
So it still has a place.
Absolutely. In the hands of a highly experienced, deeply trained clinician, it remained a uniquely powerful tool for mapping the unconscious processes that objective, true-false tests simply cannot reach.
Moving from the abstract ink blots to something slightly more concrete, we have the second most popular projective test in the arsenal, the thematic apperception test, or the TA. This was developed by Henry Murray at the Harvard Psychological Clinic in 1943. While the Rorschach uses abstract ink, the TA uses actual scenes.
Yes, 20 black and white pictures.
Depicting human beings in various highly ambiguous situations.
The ambiguity of the scenes is the key. The textbook gives the example of card 1, a young boy sitting at a table, staring blankly at a violin resting in front of him. Or card 2, a complex farm scene with a young woman carrying books in the foreground, a man working the fields, and an older woman watching in the background.
So what does the patient do with that?
The clinician presents the card and asks the patient to make up a complete dramatic story. What is happening in the picture? What events led up to this moment? What are the characters currently thinking and feeling? And what will be the final outcome?
The mechanism here doesn't rely on visual distortion like the Rorschach. It relies on narrative identification. According to Henry Murray's overarching theory of personology, the patient will inevitably, unconsciously identify with one specific character in the story they are creating. This character is called the hero.
The hero is usually the character most similar in age and sex to the patient, or the character driving the action. The psychological mechanism dictates that the patient will attribute their own hidden needs, unexpressed desires, and internal conflicts directly to this hero.
So if the patient is stressed,
If the patient is secretly feeling overwhelmed and suffocated by their family, the hero in their story will likely be feeling suffocated.
and the environment in the story represents what Murray termed the press.
Yes, the press represents the external forces in the environment that are acting upon the hero, the stressors, the demands, the obstacles, the perceived threats. A clinician listens to the story and analyzes the interaction between the hero's needs and the environmental press.
And crucially, they look at the resolution. How does the patient believe conflicts are ultimately resolved? Do their stories, across multiple cards, always end in tragedy, failure, and death, indicating severe depression and hopelessness?
Or do they end in magical, unrealistic success without any effort, indicating grandiosity? It provides a profound, rich narrative window into the patient's worldview.
But again, the TAT suffers from the same psychometric vulnerabilities as the Rorschach. It largely lacks the hard statistical reliability of objective instruments like the MMPI. There is no single, universally accepted, rigid scoring system. Its value lies almost entirely in the qualitative, interpretive insight of the expert clinician analyzing the themes.
That is correct. It is an art guided by science. Now, there are other tools that sit somewhere in the middle ground between the rigid mathematical structure of objective tests and the total free-floating ambiguity of projective tests. For example, the sentence completion test.
Sentence completion is quite direct. The examiner provides a stem, like, my father seldom, or, when encountering frustration, I usually, and asks the patient to finish the thought with the very first thing that comes to their mind.
It's a quick association.
It is brief, it is very easy to administer, and it can provide excellent, highly targeted information about specific relationships or conflicts that might not naturally surface in a standard, unstructured interview. However, because the intent of the sentences is fairly obvious, it is very easy for a guarded patient to falsify or manipulate their answers.
Which brings us to an entirely different philosophy of measurement. What if we don't want to rely on the patient's self-reporting at all? What if we don't care about their unconscious projective fantasies?
What's left?
What if we just want to watch the storm happen and measure the rainfall? That is the domain of behavioral assessment.
Behavioral assessment completely strips away all the psychoanalytic theorizing about unconscious conflicts, and it strips away the trait theory of the MMPI. It involves the direct, objective, empirical measurement of a specific, defined target behavior. Early, strict behaviorists only cared about overt, physically observable actions.
For instance, a behavioral assessment might involve a clinician sitting in a classroom and counting the exact number of times a child engages in a physical temper tantrum per hour. Or in a hospital setting, tracking the exact duration in minutes and seconds and the physical intensity of a patient's hyperventilation episodes. It relies on observable facts, not internal states.
But the textbook notes that modern behavioral assessment has evolved and broadened to include covert behaviors, meaning internal thoughts and feelings. But how do you mathematically count a thought? You can't see it.
You make the patient the active informant, but in a highly structured, mechanical way. A patient suffering from severe depression might be instructed to carry a small, mechanical clicker counter in their pocket.
A clicker counter.
Yeah, they are told to press it every single time they experience a specific, self-disparaging thought like, "I am worthless," throughout the day. They bring the counter back to the clinic, and suddenly you have quantified an internal experience.
That's fascinating.
The massive advantage is that it provides a direct, highly objective numerical baseline. If the patient clicks 50 times on week 1 and only 10 times on week 4 after starting medication, you have empirical proof of change. The disadvantage, however, is reactivity.
Reactivity.
The mere act of forcing a patient to consciously monitor and count a behavior often inadvertently alters the frequency of that behavior.
We also have rating scales, where the clinician does the quantifying based on their expert observation during an interview. The text highlights the brief psychiatric rating scale, or the BPRS, which is incredibly famous in the field.
The BPRS is an absolutely vital tool, particularly in clinical research, drug outcome studies, and inpatient wards. After completing a standard, comprehensive mental status interview with a patient, the psychiatrist sits down and rates the patient across 18 highly specific psychiatric symptoms.
Things like blunted affect, conceptual disorganization, somatic concern, anxiety, and motor retardation. They rate each symptom using a 7-point Likert scale ranging from not present to extremely severe.
It's fast. It only takes an experienced clinician 2 or 3 minutes to complete post-interview, and numerous studies show it has excellent inter-rater reliability around 0.80, meaning 2 different psychiatrists watching the same interview will likely give the patient the same BPRS score.
But the text does note a significant vulnerability: examiner subjectivity and interviewing style. If I am the psychiatrist and I spend the entire 45-minute interview focusing heavily on your physical, somatic complaints, and I completely forget to ask probing questions about your potential paranoia or auditory hallucinations, I am going to rate your suspiciousness artificially low on the BPRS simply because I didn't elicit it.
Exactly. The rating scale is only as good as the clinical interview that preceded it, which is why these tools must be used as part of a comprehensive battery. And speaking of targeted, specific tools, we must briefly mention rapid assessment instruments.
The short ones.
Yes, these are narrow-band, highly focused self-report tests designed to measure one specific, unidimensional aspect of symptomatology.
Things like the Beck Depression Inventory, the BDI, or the State Trait Anxiety Inventory, the SUDI AI. These are ubiquitous in clinics.
They are everywhere because they are incredibly efficient. They are short, often completed in under 10 or 15 minutes in the waiting room. They are highly face-valid, meaning the questions obviously relate to the condition being measured.
And easy to score.
Exceptionally simple, usually just adding up the total points to see if the patient crosses a specific clinical cutoff score, indicating mild, moderate, or severe pathology. They are fantastic tools for repeated weekly use to monitor changes during psychotherapy or to see if an antidepressant is actually working over time.
But they have a massive, glaring psychometric blind spot, don't they?
They do. Unlike the massive, sophisticated MMPI-2, most rapid assessment tools have absolutely no built-in validity scales. They have no L scale, no F scale.
Sorry, lie detectors.
They cannot statistically detect if a patient is faking bad to get disability benefits, faking good to get discharged from a hospital, or just trying to be socially desirable to please their therapist. As a clinician, you have to take the numerical results at absolute face value, which requires a strong, trusting clinical alliance.
Okay, so let's step back and survey the landscape. We have assembled a massive, complex architectural toolkit. We have the heavy, empirical, objective blueprints of the MMPI-2 with its brilliant validity scales. We have the modern dimensional modeling of the PID-5 tracking specific trait facets. We have the psychoanalytic flashlights of the Rorschach and the TAC to look into the dark, unmapped rooms of the unconscious mind. And we have the direct tape measures of behavioral rating scales and the BPRS.
That is the complete psychometric arsenal.
But how do psychiatrists actually deploy this arsenal in the real world to solve actual clinical mysteries? This is where the theory hits the pavement.
The primary, most crucial utility of psychological testing in the clinical wild is assisting in differential diagnosis. Psychiatric diagnosis is incredibly difficult, far more difficult than most branches of medicine, because vastly different underlying pathologies can produce the exact same surface-level symptoms.
The textbook presents a brilliant, complex case study to illustrate this exact point. Let's walk through it.
Let's do it.
We have a 49-year-old white male patient. He has worked steadily and successfully as a conservative accountant his entire adult life. He has no prior psychiatric history. Suddenly, completely out of the blue, he abruptly resigns from his accounting firm. He decides, with absolute conviction, that he is going to start an oil exploration business, an industry he knows absolutely nothing about and has no capital to fund.
And when the psychiatrist probes for the precipitating event for this massive career change, the patient reveals he received a revelation from an unknown entity through a persistent auditory hallucination. This voice promised him massive, unfathomable wealth if he followed its specific directions to drill for oil.
And there are severe physiological and behavioral changes accompanying this. His normally meticulous grooming deteriorates. He becomes highly disheveled. He starts sleeping only 2 or 3 hours a night, yet he reports feeling completely energized, not tired at all. He becomes physically agitated, pacing the room, and he starts talking loudly, pressuring his speech onto everyone around him, unable to stop.
So, as the attending psychiatrist, you are faced with a highly complex, volatile clinical picture. You clearly have severe psychotic features, the auditory hallucinations and the bizarre, grandiose delusion of impending oil well.
They're very severe.
But you also have textbook, severe manic features, the drastically decreased need for sleep, the extreme grandiosity, the physical agitation, the pressured speech. The differential diagnosis essentially boils down to 2 distinct pathways.
Is this the sudden onset of schizophrenia, or is this bipolar I disorder currently in a severe manic episode with psychotic features?
And this is exactly where simply looking at the weather, the hallucinations, and the mania isn't enough. Both storms look identical from the outside. You need to look at the structural foundation of a house to know how to treat them.
How does psychological testing actually help tease this apart?
Testing allows us to look underneath the acute, noisy symptoms to evaluate the patient's underlying, enduring personality structure and their fundamental thought organization. The psychiatrist refers the patient for a full battery. If the psychologist administers the MMPI-2 and the Rorschach, they're looking for specific divergent patterns.
Let's say it's schizophrenia. What do the blueprints show?
If the underlying pathology is schizophrenia, we expect the testing to reveal profound, chronic, structural deficits in cognitive mediation and reality testing. The Rorschach inquiry phase might reveal deeply idiosyncratic, bizarre associations, and a complete failure to perceive conventional reality.
Indicating it's a permanent feature.
Right, indicating a permanent, enduring thought disorder that exists independent of his mood. The MMPI-2 profile might show massive chronic elevations on scale 8 schizophrenia, combined with severe social alienation, emotional blunting, and an inability to form attachments. The architecture itself is crumbling.
But what if it is bipolar disorder? How does the test look different if he's just in a manic storm?
If it is bipolar disorder with psychotic features, the underlying baseline personality architecture might actually be relatively intact beneath the acute mania. The Rorschach might show extremely poor impulse control and severe affective dysregulation.
Wow.
The manic energy is currently overpowering the system.
Right, but the foundation is okay.
Exactly. His fundamental ability to perceive reality conventionally, his underlying cognitive mediation, might still be present and measurable when the acute manic storm passes. The psychological testing successfully separates the episodic cyclical mood disturbance of bipolar from the chronic, disintegrative, pervasive process of a primary psychotic disorder.
And getting that differential diagnosis right isn't an academic exercise. It dictates an entirely different psychopharmacological intervention and a vastly different long-term therapeutic prognosis. Testing isn't just about applying a label. It is actively directing life-saving treatment.
Precisely. But acute clinical settings in hospitals aren't the only places these assessment batteries are deployed. The textbook heavily emphasizes the medical-legal context forensic psychiatry. This is a high-stakes, adversarial environment where the validity scales of objective tests become absolute lifesavers for the expert witness.
Forensic assessments are deeply fraught with the concept of secondary gain. The text gives a classic example. A patient is suing for massive financial compensation in a civil lawsuit, claiming they suffer from severe, debilitating psychological suffering and post-traumatic stress disorder following a severe motor vehicle accident involving a commercial truck.
The forensic psychiatrist tasked with evaluating this patient faces a daunting challenge.
Yeah.
They have to definitively determine, is this a genuine, debilitating trauma response requiring compensation and care, or is the patient intentionally symptom magnifying, faking the severity of their distress for a multi-million-dollar payout?
You absolutely cannot just rely on a standard clinical interview in that scenario. The incentive to lie is too high, and patients can easily Google the symptoms of PTSD and recite them to you.
You must administer an objective test, like the MMPI-2. The forensic psychologist meticulously analyzes the F scale and the other highly specialized validity scales designed to mathematically detect faking bad. They look at the specific, nuanced symptom patterns.
What do malingerers usually do?
Clinical research shows that malingerers often overendorse bizarre, extreme, or stereotypical symptoms of PTSD, claiming they have constant cinematic flashbacks 24 hours a day, while completely missing the subtle, nuanced realities of the disorder that true trauma survivors actually exhibit, like emotional numbing or specific avoidance behaviors.
It's a caricature of the illness.
Exactly. The psychometric data provides a hard, objective, mathematical anchor to support the psychiatrist's expert testimony when they are being cross-examined in a hostile courtroom.
But testing isn't just for courts and diagnoses. It also has a powerful role directly embedded in psychotherapy. It isn't just a cold assessment tool used before treatment. The act of testing can be a profound intervention in itself.
Absolutely. The textbook notes its immense value, especially in short-term, problem-centered therapy paradigms, where the clinician doesn't have the luxury of spending 6 months slowly uncovering the patient's deep-seated issues. Administering an objective personality inventory at the very outset of therapy provides the patient with highly objective, undeniable information about themselves, compared to thousands of other people in the normative data.
It aggressively reveals their blind spots. A patient might genuinely not realize how deeply hostile, how suspicious, or how socially detached they actually are until they sit down with a therapist and see their personal scores plotted on a graph against a normal population. It cuts straight through their psychological denial in a way that just talking sometimes can't.
Furthermore, in some therapeutic modalities, collaboratively reviewing the psychological test report becomes the central focus of early treatment sessions. Projective tests in particular might reveal inner feelings, recurring fears, or latent images that completely bypass the patient's conscious, intellectualized defenses, rapidly accelerating the therapeutic breakthrough.
And crucially, from a scientific standpoint, testing provides a hard baseline.
It does.
If you use a rapid assessment tool like the BDI Weekly, or if you re-administer a full personality inventory a year later, you can objectively, numerically quantify whether the psychotherapy is actually working and structural change is occurring.
So we clearly see the immense multifaceted power of these tools. But this leads to a critical, non-negotiable warning for anyone listening who is currently practicing or training in psychiatry. This brings us to integration and clinical reasoning, how to actually think like a psychiatrist when using these tools.
This is perhaps the most important practical operational lesson in the entire chapter. In general internal medicine, if a physician suspects a patient has a liver problem, they order a standard liver function test. The laboratory runs the blood, the machine spits out a number, and the doctor interprets that number.
Psychiatry does not work that way.
No, a psychological test is not a blood draw. A psychiatrist cannot just write a referral script that simply says, order a psychological test, and expect to get a useful answer back from the psychologist.
Never. The textbook is absolutely explicit on this point. You must ask a highly specific referral question. The psychologist administering the test is not a laboratory technician running a sample through a machine. They are a highly trained consulting specialist conducting a complex, tailored investigation.
So what happens if you just ask for testing?
If a psychiatrist just asks for general testing, they will receive a mountain of generic data, 50 pages of T-scores, that may completely miss the subtle clinical nuance they were actually struggling with.
The text lists excellent examples of the art of the referral question. Instead of writing, test this patient, the psychiatrist should ask something specific. Is the patient currently psychotic, or are they experiencing severe dissociation? Or does this patient have an underlying thought disorder like schizophrenia, or is this bipolar mania?
Or does this patient actually have an attention deficit disorder, or are there profound concentration problems due to an underlying severe anxiety disorder?
Those specific targeted questions dictate the entire battery of tests the psychologist will select.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the referral question involves forensic competency, such as, does this patient have the necessary cognitive and personality resources to assist in their own defense in a criminal murder case?
Mhm.
Or, is this patient feigning a psychiatric disorder to avoid trial? The consulting psychologist immediately knows they must heavily utilize objective instruments with robust, heavily validated validity scales, and perhaps supplement them with highly specialized malingering assessments.
They won't rely heavily on a TAT for a malingering question.
Right, the question dictates the tools.
And the final product that the psychiatrist receives, the integrated assessment, is not just a spreadsheet of numbers and percentiles.
Correct. The expert psychologist synthesizes multiple overlapping streams of data. They integrate the patient's biopsychosocial history, the direct behavioral observations made during the mental status interview, the hard objective psychometric data from the MMPI, and the nuanced projective narrative themes from the Rorschach.
Pulling it all together.
They weave all of this complex data into a cohesive, comprehensive narrative report that directly, explicitly answers the referring psychiatrist's specific question. They translate the abstracts, mathematical architecture of the personality back into actionable clinical reality.
We have covered an immense, truly staggering amount of ground today. Let's distill the key takeaways from this chapter. If our listeners take nothing else back to their clinics regarding personality assessment, what are the absolute core clinical lessons?
First and foremost, personality reflects enduring, pervasive patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving. It is the permanent foundation of the house, not the passing weather of the symptoms. Second, personality assessment is crucial because it helps explain how individuals uniquely experience and respond to the world, to stress, and to their own symptoms.
Third, no single psychological test is perfect. Multiple assessment methods, objective inventories, projective techniques, behavioral tracking provide complementary, necessary perspectives on a patient's overall functioning. Fourth, and this represents the major paradigm shift brought by the PID-5, we must remember that personality traits exist on continuous dimensions rather than strict, rigid, arbitrary diagnostic categories.
Fifth, personality heavily, undeniably influences symptom expression, coping mechanisms, and ultimately treatment outcomes. Two different people with the exact same diagnosis of major depression will respond entirely differently to therapy and medication based on their underlying personality architecture. Sixth, we must always remember that assessment identifies both vulnerabilities and strengths. It is not just a hunt for pathology and brokenness. It is equally about finding the adaptive traits, the psychological resilience, and the relational capacities that will anchor the patient's recovery.
Seventh, severe personality pathology often simply reflects the inflexible, extreme, or maladaptive expression of otherwise normal human traits. And finally, understanding the unique, complex psychological architecture of the individual personality is absolutely fundamentally essential for providing individualized, effective, compassionate psychiatric care.
Very well summarized. Now let's move to our learning reinforcement. We have a quick clinical reasoning check for you, the listener. I will read a few single best answer questions based on the text, pause for a moment so you can think, and then provide the answer and rationale.
Let's do it.
Question 1. Which psychometric property describes the degree to which a test measures what it purports to measure, utilizing data outside the test itself, such as physician visits? We'll give you a second. All right, the answer is criterion or construct validity. It relies on external, objective markers.
Question 2. On the MMPI-2, a patient scores extremely high on the F scale. What are the two most likely clinical interpretations of this manifestation? Take a moment. Okay, the answer. Severe psychopathology like acute psychosis or intentional malingering and faking bad. The clinical setting dictates which is more probable.
Question 3. In John E. Exner's comprehensive system for the Rorschach test, what specific action does the examiner take immediately after the patient's initial free association to all 10 cards? Think about it. The answer is, the examiner conducts an inquiry phase, going back through the cards and asking the patient to point out exactly what they saw and what specifically made it look like that.
Question 4. The personality inventory for DSM-5, the PID-5, measures 25 personality trait facets. How many broad domains of personality are these facets grouped into under the DSM-5 alternative model? All right, the answer is 5 broad domains. Those are negative affect, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism.
And our final question, number 5. When requesting a psychological assessment, what is the most critical step a referring psychiatrist must take to ensure the results are clinically useful? Take a second. the answer. They must provide a specific referral question rather than just asking for general testing.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the architecture of the mind, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. If our personalities truly are the enduring, load-bearing architecture of our minds, and these incredibly rigorous psychometric tests are the blueprints that map that invisible structure, it raises a fascinating philosophical and clinical question. When a patient undergoes years of intensive, painful psychotherapy, and we re-administer these exact same tests to measure their change, do the blueprints themselves fundamentally change? Does the concrete foundation of who they are actually shift? Or do we simply learn how to arrange the furniture better? Do we just learn how to live more comfortably, more adaptively, and with less suffering within the permanent walls of the house we were given? It is something profound to ponder as you continue to explore the fascinating intersection of brain, mind, and experience. Here are the details of this episode.
Personality assessment of adults. Byline. Symptoms tell us what is happening. Personality helps explain why.